Our first roundtable of our series of 6 is Diversifying the Curriculum. And our first speaker is Alberica Bazzoni. She is a research fellow at the ICI Berlin Institute for Cultural Inquiry. She completed her doctorate at the University of Oxford, and her main research areas are modern Italian literature, sociology of culture, gender and sexuality studies, and the philosophy of time. She's the author of the text Writing for Freedom, Body, Identity, and Power in Goulart de Sapienza's Narrative, which just came out a couple of years ago. And her title today is Changing Corpus, Changing Affect, Feminist Revisions of the Italian Literary Canon in Italian Studies. So, Alberica, do you want to begin?
Let me share my screen. Here we are. Okay, so thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the organizers for organizing this in the first place. So my talk today is about high school textbooks, and it is part of a wider project entitled The Gender of Literature, Italian Women Writers and the Literary Canon, that was funded by the British Academy, and that I carried out at the University of Warwick, in which I carried out a vast investigation of the literary canon from a gender perspective, looking at didactic material, syllabi, high school and university textbooks, at the literary system, including publishing, festivals, prizes, criticism. I conducted interviews with contemporary writers and looked at the writer's own authorial voice as emerging from their own texts. And today I'll talk specifically about high school textbooks. I took into consideration 24 anthologies from 1992 to 2016, analyzing the presence of women writers with a specific focus on the 20th century to today, their positioning within the critical and historiographical discourse, and the critical judgments expressed on writers, their rhetoric and the themes that are emphasized. So in this graph, you can see the presence, anthologized, present in paragraphs or not present at all, of some women writers. And starting from the bottom, from Antonia Pozzi, who is not there in any of the textbooks that I have analyzed. And I could have chosen many other writers, most notably the case of Fabrizia Ramondino, who, like Pozzi, does not appear in any of these 24 anthologies. And then jumping to the top, where we see Morante, who is the one woman writer who has made it into the Italian literary canon. And yet, even Morante can be excluded at any point, because as we can see, she's completely absent in 3 of these textbooks and only present in passing in paragraphs in another 4. So overall, this picture sadly registers the pervasive absence of women writers from textbooks and shows the gap, the huge gap existing between research being carried out in Italy and in Italian studies internationally, the appreciation of the work of women writers, and how little of this research is currently translated into didactic material, the canon in textbooks. Now, I want to give an example of a high school textbooks for Italians. For those who are not familiar, I chose an example from 2016, quite an average one, divided in 3 periods, and each period divided in a general introduction, anthologized texts by representative authors, and extended section on major authors, I classici. And I can say from now that none of these classici are women writers in either this textbook or any of the textbooks that I have analyzed. So this is the first section for the first period, and I have highlighted in red women authors and in blue male authors. We're not going to read it all, but just to give you a snapshot, which I think really speaks for itself, especially because of the large number of authors that are included, and therefore the space that potentially there could be. For the first period, the classics, Svevo, Pirandello, Gadda, Ungaretti, Montale, and then a cluster of other authors that are listed in dialogue with these classics. It is after World War II, the second period, that we encounter the first women. We have Renata Viganò, in the neorealism section. And it is interesting to know that it is in this expansion online, that is not actually in the textbook, but in the additional material that can be found online. Morante and Ginsburg, significantly Il ritorno al privato. And then we have poet Franca Grisoni and Amelia Rosselli, again in an online expansion. Among the classics, Calvino and Luzzi. Coming to the last period, we find Valduga for poetry, Morante again, and then Pariani in an online expansion. And this is how the table of content of an average contemporary textbook looks like. There are other strategies that some textbooks pursue, for example, grouping women writers in separate sections, therefore giving them visibility, but at the same time putting them in separate boxes, such as Elsa Morante e le narratrici, Elsa Morante e le scrittrici, L'apporto delle scrittrici, Parole al femminile, or Tre poetesse, Nerini Valduga, Cavalli. Another attempt that I have seen in different textbooks is that of at least thematizing gender as a factor. For example, in this textbook in 2011, in which we have throughout the whole volume thematic sections on l'amore e la donna, interestingly, all by male authors. But then also some paragraphs dedicated to at least tackling the question, the problem of the relationship between women and society, women and writing, dal femminismo dell'uguaglianza al femminismo della differenza, and La scrittura e le donne. Now, this is about who is there and where they are. There's also the question of how they are discussed, and I will be very brief on this, just examples of critical judgments that are not representative of the general way in which women writers are treated, but just to show that it is not enough to be there, which is already a big achievement, to be valued. For example, about Deledda, tra questi più importanti insieme a Svevo e Pirandello sono la scrittrice sarda Deledda, omaggiata nel 26 con il premio Nobel per la letteratura, e soprattutto Federico Tozzi. Or about Morante, gli schemi che regolano il romanzo sono decisamente ottocenteschi, o il realismo naturalistico, la visione razionalistica del decadentismo. Tuttavia la scrittrice, mentre nella rappresentazione realistica resta prigioniera di moduli narrativi consunti, riesce a riprendere questa tematica dell'infanzia con originalità. Or again, in a textbook by 2012, she's mentioned as moglie di Moravia. She deals with tematiche tradizionali and storie intimistiche private, and la storia is pubblicitario and iperpopolare. Now, all this tells us confirms us sadly, how the canon is still the expression of an exclusionary hegemonic institution. So to say it in the words of Lydia Curti, the articulation of the literary discipline is a form of violence parallel to that of the national formation to which it is linked, and it is mirrored in didactic practices, which are often exclusionary. Such a form of discrimination is generally directed against eccentric and minority writings in connection to sexual, ethnic, geographic, and social differences. And again, in the words of Forenza, the problem of the canon does not originate from a need to document the historical movements that constituted a collective subjectivity. Instead, it serves a monumentalizing purpose aimed to the eternalization of specific values through a process of dehistoricization, actualization, and normative prescription. So where do we go if we want to change? I don't know what happened with the Zoom thing that I cannot change my slide. Just a second. I cannot change my slide, but anyway, I'll continue. So where do we go when we want to change the literary canon?
If you take your cursor off the slide, you might be able to advance it.
Okay, yeah, it worked. Okay, thank you. So I suggest three directions, and I'm not saying anything new, but just putting things together. Changing the corpus, sadly, is still the first necessary step. Multiplying voices that are represented and entitled to speak, breaking down the monologism of the hegemonic subject. But then changing the interpretative tools, meaning including an analysis of gender alongside other markers of identity as a principle of organization of society and of the symbolic. And revising critical categories based exclusively on text by hegemonic subjects, forming new categories on the basis of a different corpus. In other words, changing the narrative. And thirdly, changing the canon as a normative institution itself. How? This is difficult, but valuing the experience of reading and the specificity of each voice, and making an effort to keeping the canon open, constantly challenging and unsettling established hierarchies. And I conclude on an example of a recent textbook published in 2021, so very recently, that is not for Italian students, but for students of Italian, that takes a very different angle from the ones that I have shown you so far. And as you can see from the table of contents, only about the 20th century to today, definitely a different version of the Italian literary canon is possible. Thank you very much. And I hand you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. I will continue to take your questions in the chat, so please keep sending them, and I'll introduce our next presenter. Dr. Maya Smith is a sociolinguist and an associate professor at the Department of French and Italian Studies at the University of Washington. Her scholarship broadly focuses on the intersection of racial and linguistic identity formations among marginalized groups in the Francophone African diaspora. She's also interested in pedagogical issues in French and in Italian studies, such as she has a forthcoming article entitled Creating a More Diverse, Equitable, and Inclusive French Foreign Language Classroom, which will be coming out in the ADLF Bulletin. Her presentation today is entitled Inclusive Pedagogies in Italian Studies, Using Sociolinguistic Data to Decolonize the Curriculum. So thank you, we're delighted to have you here, and the time is yours.
Thank you so much. When students take courses in Italian studies, most expect to learn about the cultural and linguistic contributions of white Europeans. Language learning textbooks and the literary canon reinforce this image. However, both historically and in present day, understandings of race in Italy and the Italian diaspora are much more complex. With the recent increase in migration to Italy, the nature of Italian identity and who can claim Italianness or Italianità has become highly contested in the public sphere. One way for students to think critically about Italian studies is by learning about the lived experiences of its minoritized and marginalized inhabitants. In addition to literary works of Black Italians such as Kuma or Shego, including interview data on language ideologies offers a complementary way to decolonize the curriculum. Let's see. All right. Based on sociolinguistic ethnographic research analyzed in my book, Senegal Abroad, this presentation will look at how members of the Italian diaspora conceptualize where they fit in Italianità through their reflections on language learning and cultural belonging. Taking a sociolinguistic approach in Italian studies is important because students are constantly grappling with their own experiences as language learners and linguistic beings. And language is something that intersects with various other identity markers, a reality that people from minoritized and marginalized groups, such as those in my research, experience quite acutely. As Kubota argues, linguistic legitimacy goes beyond the ability to speak a language. It is determined by a discourse that produces a certain linguistic and racialized profile as legitimate or illegitimate speakers. And emphasizing how linguistic competence does not guarantee societal acceptance in Italy, Lombardi-Diop and Romeo argue that Italianità seems unattainable for Black Italians, precisely because national belonging is generally understood in terms of specific traits, both cultural and biological, that cannot be simply acquired by a perfect mastery of the language and the Italian way of life. In other words, skin color and other racialized markers impose restrictions on Black Italians' claim to Italianità, even when they possess Italian language abilities. At the same time, I have found that although dominant societal discourses often malign migrants, people of color, and non-native speakers, members of these groups push back against negative characterization, negotiating Italian identity in creative and novel ways. My interviewee's strategic use of language does just so and represents a model that productively opens up Italian studies. Giving students access to sociolinguistic texts is one way to decolonize the curriculum. Our students, many of whom are international or from immigrant backgrounds, sometimes struggle with their multilingual and multicultural identities, viewing them as a hindrance instead of an asset because of our pedagogy myopically focuses on teaching students how to use the target language and monolinguistic sterile vacuums. What happens when we present non-literary texts by non-white people to our diverse classrooms? What happens when texts in the target language are not just by monolingual native speakers? As Claire Cramsch and Ann Whiteside argue, social actors in multilingual settings seem to activate more than a communicative competence that would enable them to communicate accurately, effectively, and appropriately with one another. They seem to display a particularly acute ability to play with various linguistic codes and with the various spatial and temporal resonances of these codes. We call this competence symbolic competence. Therefore, if we promote students' investment in the learning process and empower them by building on their already existing linguistic and cultural capital, they are better equipped to navigate the diverse societies in which they would use their languages. Multilingual sociolinguistic texts not only expand students' understanding of their abilities as multilingual beings, but also redefine Italianità, a central concept in Italian studies. Senegal, as a former French colony and a multilingual country with over 25 recognized national languages, has a complex relationship to language. It also has a robust migratory tradition. My interviewees take great pride in their mobility and their multilingual repertoires, extolling the virtues of being able to cross geographic and linguistic borders. However, they celebrate more than just being able to speak many languages. They also enjoy the different identities they acquire because of those languages. For instance, during a tantalizing conversation at a Senegalese restaurant in Rome, various Senegalese patrons negotiate national identities in a manner that plays on words and languages in a creative way. Here, Edie, a friend, and Bashir joke about being Italian, and the translation is on the right. Non mi piacciono I senegalesi, e per questo io ho tornato italiano adesso, capito? I senegalesi parlano troppo, capito? Hai visto questo? Chi è italiano? Sei italiano? Sì. Meno male, poi, non è male che cosa? Perché sei italiano adesso? Noi siamo dei senegalesi, capito? Je suis fière d'être sénégalais. Wahko si italien. Ecco io, grazie a tutti. Jorko si endokmi munan si italien. Boko si italien. Waye ben la. Astafurlah. While the conversations at the restaurant are normally in Wolof, the most widely spoken Senegalese language, unless a non-Wolof speaker was being addressed, it makes sense for Edie to begin this topic in Italian, since he is discarding his Senegalese identity. Deciding he does not want to be Senegalese because they talk too much, he claims an Italian identity instead. His friend challenges Edie by suggesting he is drunk for saying such a thing, and then offers us an us versus him framework through the use of the word noi, where noi includes all Senegalese except for Edie, who is now defected. Although this exchange is obviously in jest, where there is laughing in the background and a lack of seriousness in their voices, Bashir's interruption, Je suis fière d'être sénégalais, I am proud to be Senegalese, conveys a need to voice pride in this identity. It is surprising that Bashir would use French to profess his Senegalese heritage when he typically speaks Wolof and discusses in other conversations how French as a colonial language is an imposition. While it is unclear why he makes his assertion in French instead of Wolof, it reiterates what many of my interviewees claim. Being Senegalese involves being able to move between space and language, what I have termed global Senegality. Meanwhile, for the people present, Italianità has transformed from being simply an identity marked by the language spoken to being an identity that encompasses every aspect of living. For instance, the friend tells Edie to drink the water in Italian. Edie retorts by arguing that drinking is not included in the Italian language, an argument that the friend dismisses. Even though Edie presents his claim on Italianità in a humorous manner, he shows that identity is dynamic and that the nature of Italianità deserves to be negotiated. Negotiating Italianità does not just happen in Rome, though. Senegalese and other parts of the diaspora carry their experiences with Italy, Italian, and Italianità as they move throughout the world. No one illustrates this better than Ousseynou, a 37-year-old taxi driver from Dakar, who I interviewed over tea at a Senegalese French restaurant in Harlem, New York. In the beginning, when engaged in casual conversation, Ousseynou, the Senegalese waiter who interacts with us off and on, and I speak in a mix of French and Wolof. I then start my interview with Ousseynou in French, but when I ask him what his favorite language is, he code switches to Italian to profess his love of Italian. Upon overhearing us, the waiter interjects in Italian, displaying the penchant for migrating and acquiring multiple languages that so many in my study champion. The following is what occurred next. Ma ça fait 8 ans mangi filegi. Ora io sono qui da 5 mesi. 5 mesi? Ah, 5 mesi che sono qui. Ah, ok, però io sono laureato in lingue. Anch'io. Perciò ho studiato lingue, inglese, francese, spagnolo, portoghese. Anch'io. Sì, un perfetto uomo che parla tutto. Ah oui, tu as vu, hein? Ça c'est les Sénégalais. Oui, oui, c'est incroyable. Les Sénégalais aiment voyager, aiment apprendre des langues. Tu vois? C'est ça, c'est intéressant. Through their use of and praise for Italian, both Ousseynou and the waiter make ownership claims on the Italian language, while simultaneously signaling what they view as an emphatically Senegalese identity in the way they switch between languages. Code switching between Italian, French, Wolof, and Spanish in the lines "Ma ça fait 8 ans mangi 5 mesi" seems second nature. Ousseynou then punctuates the importance of the robust multilingualism with the remark, "Un perfetto uomo che parla tutto." For him, Senegalese endeavor to embody a multilingual identity and accumulate symbolic competence in doing so, the pinnacle of perfection. And because I think I'm out of time, I will just put my conclusion slide up here for you to see, and I cede the floor.
Thank you very, very much. That was wonderful. Thank you. And we have a virtual applause. Thank you very much from Maya. Our next presenter will be Mark Chu. He is a senior lecturer at the Department of Italian at the University of College Cork in Ireland, where he served as the head of the department from 2003 to 2018. His research and his teaching address, among other things, questions of identity and migration in Italian culture. He's currently working on a book project on the representation of the Chinese in Italian literature and screen media. He's published widely on Sicilian literature, and he was the editor-in-chief for the first 3 issues of Todo Mondo, the International Journal of Xhosa Studies. And his presentation today begins with the title, Languages for All. And the time is yours, Mark.
Okay, so as I was saying, very quick thanks to all the organizers of these events, and straight into my topic, about which I'll be providing a necessarily brief overview of preliminary work. My contribution today involves a project for which I'm currently applying for funding here in UCC. When submitting my abstract, I'd hoped to have completed more work on the project, but COVID and other things has meant that I'm still at a very early stage of this project. Today, I'll be limiting my attention to examining materials and postponing my exploration of teaching materials to a later date. The project was prompted by this tweet. I can't see if my screen is advancing. Sorry about this. Do it manually. Okay, so it was prompted by this this tweet last October, and by the linked online article in Tests, formerly the Times Educational Supplement, by Dave Speck, commenting on the publication of the survey report by the United Kingdom's National Association of Language Advisors on, on the languages curriculum and disadvantaged students, which investigates the extent to which language professionals felt that the language tasks involved in secondary school modern foreign languages assessment further disadvantaged students. Indeed, NALA's initial research revealed that, quote, questions about holidays, family relationships, descriptions of a student's house, restaurant visits, and live events were potentially problematic for vulnerable and disadvantaged pupils, end quote. The report also addresses questions such as the tension between suggesting that students might, as a strategy of avoiding any discomfort, invent stories or assume an alternative persona in tasks, or assume an alternative persona in tasks which are clearly intended to elicit supposedly authentic communicative acts. The report prompted me to explore the extent to which the same forms of assessment might be present in the Irish context, and to question my own possible complicity as National University of Ireland representative on the State Examinations Commission for the subject Italian, providing feedback to the examination setter. As I'll be standing down from that role this year due to the fact that my son will be taking the Leaving Certificate examination in Italian next year, I hope to be able to pass on some concrete, evidence-based results and advice to my successor and to the hardworking and conscientious exam setters who prepare the standard assessment examinations for school leavers in Ireland. At some stage in our careers as language learners and teachers, we've probably all either been asked or asked students to write or talk in their target language about family, home, holidays, travel abroad, etc. We may or may not have given thought to the extent to which the questions asked, the linguistic models provided, and the tasks set might be based on assumptions about the composition of a family and about access to travel, or how the simple task of describing the family home has the potential to create unease for some students. My project will study the extent to which the materials used to teach and examine modern foreign languages in the Irish secondary school system is still based on assumptions about families, living conditions, and access to travel, which we might categorize broadly as middle class, and may therefore contribute to creating an unintentional barrier to inclusiveness in the learning of languages. In short, the answer to my research question, based on a preliminary sampling of a to date very limited number of Leaving Certificate written papers in modern foreign languages, is that this type of question and the value system it naturalizes is indeed still present. Although there are also some examples of representations of other realities, such as this question from the higher level Leaving Certificate examination in Spanish in 2019, the year I've sampled, about the experience of student workers. The equivalent French paper includes questions such as these, which test students' ability to develop in writing an argument on topics such as drugs or sport. While I'm conscious of the risk of stereotyping and making generalizations about disadvantaged students, I think that what I perceive to be an attempt to include topics related to students' experience still needs to be considered alongside, for example, statistics for participation in sport, information which I've yet to mine in the Central Statistics Office Ireland website, but which my experience as a sports coach suggests to me is yet another area in which many disadvantaged students are left behind. Other questions on the same paper presuppose an experience which is more overtly determined by socioeconomic status, asking students to write a diary entry about having attended a big concert, or alternatively, an email to a French friend talking about university life in Ireland, something to which, in theory, the Leaving Certificate examination provides access for all successful students, but with which, in reality, some students will have familiarity through the experiences of other family members, while others most definitely will not. The ordinary level, the lower level French paper, asks students to fill in a form to set up a house exchange, while the equivalent Italian paper has students write a dialogue about a planned vacanza studio in Italy. The higher level Italian paper sets the student the task of writing to a hotel to retrieve a forgotten laptop durante il loro ultimo viaggio in Italia. So you can see this pattern of this idea of the normality, the naturalness of travel that is assumed as something that students have access to. Relatively cheap package holidays in Spain are in fact enjoyed by many Irish people across the social spectrum, although of course not by the most disadvantaged. And this question here on the Spanish paper relates to a fairly generic experience of this. But another question asks students to write about the Spanish holiday from a much more specific and less inclusive perspective, with the student required to write in the first person about a holiday with a traditional family unit of 2 architect parents and 2 children, about the family's annual European expedition and their access to credit cards for car hire, or indeed for the sisters' shopping spree, as you can see in the continuation of the dialogue here. I should make it clear that it's not my intention to demonize exam setters who are clearly attempting to produce pedagogically sound, authentic language tasks for students. 40 odd years ago, the equivalent school language papers I took in Britain consisted, as far as I can remember, of translation of literary passages from and into Italian and French, plus a discursive thema. And I was left without the ability to perform even the most basic practical task in French, while my Italian made me sound, as one friend put it, come un romanzo ottocentesco. However, I do think that it's important to reflect on the nature of the student body implied by our assessment practices, and to consider how these might compare to the reality of our society. To contextualize my observations, I prepared this slide based on my reading of the CSO's Survey on Income and Living Conditions 2019, which was also the reason why I chose 2019 exam papers for the preliminary analysis of papers. I had prepared this slide in order to illustrate that Ireland, like many countries worldwide, has issues of socioeconomic inequality. I don't really have time to comment on the statistics, other than to say that the evidence suggests that a significant proportion of school-age children is at risk of poverty or experiences consistent poverty, and to argue, therefore, that in our framing of language learning experience, we need to show awareness of this in order to avoid placing additional barriers in the way of participation. If, as some of the papers have students reflect in response to essay questions, knowledge of one or more modern foreign language provides access to employment opportunities, we must, I argue, strive to ensure that we are not alienating those students who may already face the greatest challenges in finding employment. In building on the work done by NALA in Britain and outlining practices in Ireland, I hope to contribute to creating a more inclusive environment in modern foreign languages. A further stage of the project will be the development of inclusive models of pedagogically valid linguistic tasks for the teaching and learning of modern foreign languages. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much. Am I muted? I'm not. Okay.
Thank you for sticking to the time so diligently. It makes my work as an enforcer very, very easy. I really appreciate it. I feel less of a fascist.
Everybody has, and thank you very much for very compelling ideas. Our final presenter today will be Paolo Frascà. He was born in Calabria, but he moved to Toronto when he was an adolescent. He's currently at the University of Toronto, where he teaches in the Department of Italian Studies, and he's also an affiliate of the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies. He runs multiple initiatives at the Franco Jacobocci Center for Italian Canadian Studies, and his presentation today is entitled Finding Connections, Bridging Communities, Diversifying Italian Canadian Studies Through Indigenous and Queer Perspectives. And the floor is the virtual screen is yours, Paolo.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Marie. Thanks for having me here today. I'm speaking to you from my ancestral land, and I say this for a reason. I am in Calabria at the moment, and I've had the chance to really think about what it means to be here, particularly having lived in so-called Canada for many years now. And it's returning is always very interesting. I'd like to say that my presentation today is a confluence of the knowledge and the work of not just myself, but many other people, particularly my 2 collaborators on the project that I'll quickly speak about, Drs. Angela Nardozzi and Licia Canton. Being in a teaching string professorship at the University of Toronto, I'm particularly concerned with pedagogies. And so I do have to materials to expose my students to, what feels good in that sense. I work also in the Frank Iacobucci Center for Italian Canadian Studies, and the mission of the center is an interesting one. It does wish to bring together not just scholars or intellectuals, but also artists and activists. And that looks, that looks very different when you go back in time to the 1970s or 80s or 90s, when the center was founded in the 1990s. Italian Canadian activism was probably still understood in many ways to be, be in the realm of promoting Italian Canadian culture and Italian integration in Canada. And now I'm trying to harness that in different ways. I'm glad that language is still there, and I'm really trying to also honor the namesake of the center, Frank Iacobucci, who was the first Italian Canadian Supreme Court justice in so-called Canada, who has done a lot of work with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee or Commission, and so has contributed greatly to Indigenous Crown relations, of course, in ways that can also be critiqued. What I want to do, particularly through my teaching, is to really push and contribute to shifting, Italian diaspora studies from sort of tendency to always sort of cling on to the nostalgia and glorification of particularly colonial figures, to a more sort of wholesome and decolonial honoring of Italian migration stories. And I have a couple texts here that I think really exemplify that shift in many ways. So I've got here two texts. One is by Angelo Bianchi, written in 1982. I am an Italian American, and from my ancient world, I first spanned the seas to the New World. I am Cristoforo Colombo. I am Giovanni Caboto, known in American history as John Cabot, discoverer of mainland North America. I am Amerigo Vespucci, who gave my name to the New World, America. First to sail on the Great Lakes in 1679, founder of the territory that became the state of Illinois, colonizer of Louisiana and Arkansas. I am Enrico Tonti. Of course, this is about Italian Americans, but I'm trying to point to sort of the two extremes here. One is the glorification of very colonial figures, and one is a more modern take on the Italian North American Italian migrant experience. The second text is by Macaroni's Riot, which is a Movimento Autonomo Collettivo in the United States of Italians and Sicilians. And it's actually in response to Angelo Bianchi's 1982 poem. They write, we are the children of the Italian diaspora. Roots are deep in ancient soil, drenched by Mediterranean moons and suns, watered by streams, seas, and oceans. We come from our grandmothers, whose hands toiled in the kitchen and in the soil so that we could grow to be the loving community members we are meant to become. We come from educators, storytellers, musicians, and weavers. We value family and loyalty. We feed those who cross our threshold because we have love for strangers and because we have been in need. We are the children of the Italian diaspora. We know in our very cores that creating love and connection, practicing mutual support, and leaving the world a more just and beautiful place than we found it is the best way to honor our ancestors. And so part of my effort to really push for this shift and to understand the ways in which Italian Canadian studies can be in connection with particularly current social movements, has been a project titled Indigenous Italian Canadian Connections. What this project has attempted to do is really begin through the Indigenous worldview, an idea that we are all related to one another and that there are always existing connections. Indigenous worldviews have the philosophy of interconnectedness and belonging. This is a teaching by Dr. Tracy Baer at the University of Alberta. And this is the understanding that all people are related, connected to each other, and to all life on Earth. And the common phrase, all my relations, in many Indigenous communities really attempts to reflect this respect for interconnectedness in all living things. What you see here in the images are two of the belts that represent agreements between different nations in the territory known as Canada. The first one is the Guswenta Wampum Belt, and it represents the different nations living together and sort of, going on their journey parallel one another without necessarily interfering with one another. This in Indigenous storytelling. This, the first Guswanta dates back to the 1600s. And next to it, we see the dish with one spoon wampum belt, which represents the idea of sharing resources very mindfully and slowly and in non-violent ways. There's one dish, there's one spoon, there's no knife involved in the sharing, and the dish must be passed around. So the sharing of resources has to happen mindfully. I'm showing you these belts because I want to emphasize the idea that Italian migrants to these lands are treaty people. We are treaty people, and it is our obligation to honor these treaties in many ways. So, you know, the probably most ambitious objective of this project is to actually formalize the relationship between Italian Canadians, particularly in the Greater Toronto area, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, which are the nation that sold through many purchases unfair at the very beginning, the lands known as Toronto to the British Crown. And I think part of this work is really harnessing these the feelings of nostalgia and the feelings of victimization in productive ways. And so really understanding the shift that we are actually now very much integrated in whiteness as Italian Canadians. And of course, I'm referring to white Italian Canadians. Not all Italian Canadians are white. And sort of holding on to that memory of having been unwanted immigrants, even enemy aliens in this country, and harnessing that experience, that memory of marginality, but understanding that we've integrated into whiteness in many ways, and that we have responsibilities that come with that, really important responsibilities that come with that, particularly nation-to-nation building and the honoring of treaties. The other project, oh, and I was just going to show you the posters too. This was our first event where we had folks who already embody these connections between Indigenous communities and Italian Canadian communities. And these are folks who are both Indigenous and Italian Canadians, so where this connection is palpable in their very family histories, or Italians who've worked with Indigenous communities, or Indigenous folks who have experiences with Italian culture or connected to the Italian Canadian community. Our next event is coming up. It's titled Indigenous Italian Canadian Connections, The Land We Are On. As mentioned, my collaborator for this project is Dr. Angela Nardozzi, and this is the link for our second event, which will be happening on May 20th. So you can go to that link if you wish to obtain more information or register for the event. This is what came out of the first event, Indigenous Italian Canadian Connections. It's a graphic record, which I won't go through, but a lot of the teachings from particularly the Indigenous folks whose voices were centered in this conversation have to do with respecting treaties and with honoring the initial stewards of this land, and as teachers of the humanities, also honoring the first storytellers of this land as an important part of our mission of promoting linguistic and literary diversity. The second project I'm working on, and this time with Dr. Licia Canton, is queer Italian Canadians. So really sort of expanding the understanding of Italian Canadian experiences to include experiences of sexual diversity. And what do I want to say quickly about this? Well, I'd like to say that, you know, in order for migrants to serve the colonial project that is Canada, oftentimes they either have to be laborers or they have to be, you know, that represents sort of the heteronormative family nucleus. And so including experiences of sexual and gender diversity in the Italian Canadian experience actually sort of allows us to tap into a truth of what is the Italian Canadian experience, and also sort of what I call a homecoming to a truth of Italian culture, that it is diverse in many ways, that includes many instances of sexual and stories that have to do with sexual and gender diversity. And you can watch the documentary trailer. This is a documentary directed by Licia Canton on queer Italian Canadians. It's called Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian Canadians. And you can come to our launch of Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing edited by Licia Canton. I had the pleasure of writing part of the introduction to this volume. And you can also pre-order this as well. You can Google it. I'm sure it'll be the first thing that comes up because it is the first anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing. I'd like to quickly share some reactions from students. They find the exposure to these conversations and these materials.
You have 30 seconds to wrap up.
Sure,
Sorry.
yeah, thank you, no worries. They find all of this material very eye-opening, and they say that it speaks more to their realities and that it welcomes hybrid experiences. Many of them are not just Italian, they're Italian and something else. They feel that their different identities come into conflict with one another, such as queerness and Italian traditional identity. So these kinds of conversations allow a great deal of experiences and expressions into their operation, so to speak. And then of course there are colleagues who welcome this kind of work and colleagues who find it sort of too untenably pietist, and I feel that that's only because some do not wish to remember that every curricular choice is ultimately a political one, and that our cultural and literary canons, as was said earlier, are actually very, very selective processes and choices. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. Thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you to the questions. For those of you who are sending in questions. If you'd like to go ahead and send those in, I'll go ahead and start with the questions that were asked to all four. Can I call you panelists if we're screenists? What's the term now? And so I know that makes it awkward a little bit digitally to respond to, but I'm going to start that way. First of all, I'd like to just say thank you to our presenters. I'm now reevaluating all of my classes and all the texts I've been using in classes. So I think it's changed my summer. One of the questions was about using non-literary texts, and Dr. Smith, Maya Smith addressed this in a way, but one of the first questions was how can we diversify? What kind of advice would you give to us as we're looking at changing our classes? What kinds of things can we look for when we're moving away from literary texts to try to diversify in this way?
Yeah, I mean, so in my presentation, I talked about sociolinguistic texts. Another thing to think about is language memoirs, right? So people talking about their experiences of migration and language learning could be very useful. Other texts could be music. A lot of musical, song lyrics or whatnot seem to be of great interest to students. So those are the ones that come off the top of my head. Yeah.
Other suggestions from our other panelists?
Yeah, Marie, I mean, Sylvia and I teach a final year option in our the BA in World Languages, which I direct, on language and power, and we use a lot of media texts, but also music, children's film. We look at language and race in children's film and that sort of thing. So there are all sorts of different texts. I think the response of students in that particular model is fantastic. These are students not only of Italian, but of all the range of languages that we offer within the program. And what's really interesting is that they bring their material from their different language areas, and it produces a really exciting corpus that they share. But media, popular culture, everything. It's music, as Maya was saying there. There's just so much can be done.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Again, for everybody, but especially for Alberica, how does the geographical provenance of the educational backgrounds and authors influence inclusion? And do you think that Italian studies outside of Italy plays into this?
Sorry, is the first part of the question related to the geographical provenance of the writers?
Correct.
Okay. It's spot on, but less about women writers than it is about men writers, in that there is a huge difference in reception and appreciation of works by Southern authors, but somehow this does not intersect necessarily with women Southern women authors. So when we look at prizes, for example, it tends to be authors from the center north who keep winning prizes and who are considered more prestigious. And if we look at that table of contents and look at Southern authors and Northern authors, we would find a huge disparity. Women writers, not as much, even though obviously the tendency is the same. but not as striking, also because there's so little present in general that it is difficult to do that distinction. About Italian studies in Italy and abroad, my experience and what I have researched speak of a huge difference, and transnationalism will save us, perhaps, hopefully, in that I don't have it here, it's a bit hard to show it in an online discussion, but I did research, for example, in university syllabi in comparing Italy and the UK, and I looked at about 20 universities in Italy and 20 in the UK, and who is teaching what. And the difference numerically, just numerically, is massive. So there seems to be a much better reception and openness to diversifying modules in the UK than there is in Italy. Plenty of reasons for that. It's very complicated. It is a system and not a single person dictating it. But yes, it seems that institutional constraints, especially structural constraints in Italy, make the diversifying of curricula harder, slower, more difficult, more challenging, while less attachment to institutions and traditions also in modern languages as opposed to Italianistica, make it more possible to experiment a little bit more. I hope I have answered the question.
I think you must have, because I'm not getting anything back from the chat. So absolutely, thank you very much. There's also a question for Paolo. There's been a lot of interest in the chat about if you could please explain some more about the method of the graphic novel for presenting the results on the first Indigenous Canadian panel. There's been interest in that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that was an idea by my collaborator, Dr. Angela Nardozzi, who knew about graphic recording. I had no idea what it was. Graphic recording is essentially a process by which you welcome an artist into an event, and they record the most sort of salient themes that come through, or you can request for certain things to be recorded and highlighted. This particular recording was done by Najitstal Norbert, who is an Indigenous artist, and she attended the event and took notes, drew pictures of the speakers, and it is a wonderful way of documenting events. I find we did not record this event because a lot of folks, particularly the folks who are both Indigenous and Italian Canadian, were sharing a lot of personal and familial stories, and so we wish to not record the event, but we wish to document it. And so that's a piece of art that will stay with us for a long time, and that can be used in presentations such as mine today, but also published and written about and around. So it's and also used to plan future events, and we certainly did, because part of starting that conversation was to really try to understand what our next step may be. And because a lot of the speakers discussed the presence of Italians on Indigenous land, Italians, the Italian enclaves, Italian home ownership, and so on. Well, our next event is particularly focused on treaties and on how Italian Canadians can honor Indigenous treaties. So it is really helpful. It's a helpful tool in planning future events as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Alberica's hand is up, and then I'll read another question. Did you want to answer now?
Just because I forgot, I don't want to take too much space, but something very important that I forgot in my previous answer that I thought is very important to bring here is not only the north-south divide, but also the geographical origin of writers in terms of migrant writers or second-generation writers. And they are definitely being treated differently in that they are even more marginalized in any context. And there are almost no migrant writings in textbooks, virtually none, really. Prices the same. So it's quite striking that the last textbook that I showed, that it is for non-Italian students, actually ends with Ijabashego and has Ijabashego in the title. Quite a bold move that in Italian I would find it hardly possible. And thanks for the space.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a question for Dr. Maya Smith. It's about the difference between multiculturalism and interculturalism. That the person asking the question describes multiculturalism as independent, whereas interculturalism looks at the intersections. do you think that this distinction is important? Is it important in your work? And there's been a concerted effort to diversify it. I am summarizing. It still feels like Italian language dominates. The standard the neo-standard Italian still dominates. So the prescriptive grammar still seems privileged, but if you had something to respond to about interculturalism versus multiculturalism.
Yeah, sure. I tend to use the term multiculturalism, but a more expansive definition that includes interculturalism. I mean, I think you can't separate the different identities and how they interact and relate to each other. So yes, we should be thinking about how these different identities intersect, definitely. I can speak more to the French aspect because I'm actually in the French side of my department, even though I do, present my work for my Italian colleagues courses as well. But we've been having major conversations on the French side about how do we bring in other languages into the classroom, right? How do we not just see the target language as the only way to talk about language, right? And so on the French side, I mean, we have been bringing in other languages. We've been relying on students to talk about the other languages that they speak, to share those in the classes, because out in the world, especially in countries that have more than one national language, where, in the majority of the world, people are multilingual, right? And so we try to remind students of this case, right? That in the language classroom, we try to create this space that seems like monolingualism is the norm, but that's not really how it plays out in life, right? But at the same time, you're trying to balance the space of, okay, this is a French classroom, students are here to learn French, we don't want to take away so much time from the actual French language, but students tend to have much more confidence if they can see all the different languages and how they exist together. So it's sort of balancing the time for practice versus instilling confidence in students and whatnot.
Right. Classes just need to be longer. That's what I think. Right. Thank you very much. There's another question for Paolo about celebrating Italian Canadians as a treaty people, but also wanted to talk about looking at past history and roles. The questioner cites a panel in Melbourne, if people are familiar with that one, about the interstitial positioning of Italians in Australia, and the way that their integration was played against the lack of recognition of Aboriginal peoples. And the questioner's asking if there was something similar that happened in Canada when Italians came, if their integration came at the price of the silencing, or in that space, the silencing of Native peoples?
I think generally the multicultural project that is Canada, particularly after the 1970s, has created this mosaic that is so sort of appreciated all over the world as being sort of not the perfect, one of the best multicultural mosaics that exists, but it definitely has come at the expense of Indigenous people, not only being put into one category, when we know there are multiple Indigenous nations and languages, but becoming only one piece of that mosaic, right? There's interesting work done by scholars such as Franca Iacovetta, and I forget the last name is Bohaker. They look at how the process of migration has rendered Indigenous people migrants as well. As people were populating Canada from non-original peoples, were populating Canada, the process of even arguing for Indigenous people having migrated to Canada, bearing straight theory, and so on and so forth, was very much part of the conversation. And so it definitely is part of the process. Absolutely. It has come at the expense of Indigenous, particularly has caused the sort of spectralization of Indigenous people, so being put in the past as peoples that do not exist anymore, and as becoming one part of that multicultural mosaic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's another question for Mark Chu. I'll read it. can you please speak more directly to the idea of tourism in Italy and its resonance in the curriculum, and especially on the tests that you discussed? And particularly, can disadvantaged students also have the same aspiration to enjoy tourism? And a larger problem, is there a larger problem here in the backdrop of associating Italy just in terms of a tourist experience?
Certainly, it's very difficult when you start talking about this, because you don't want to say, well, you don't want to adopt a sort of paternalistic attitude and say, well, this is outside this group of students' experiences. Of course, students can aspire to certain things, but I think to go back to the point I was making towards the end there, some of the papers and are very deliberately talking about languages as access to employment, and yet so we're trying to make language as a gateway, appealing to what our masters want us to do, and talk about the utilitarian aspect of language. So the papers are talking, trying to get students to reflect on this idea of languages as a gateway to employment and so on and so forth. But what I'm suggesting is that we, and I include myself, can very easily slip into this habit of assuming that everyone has access to the things that we might have had access to. I didn't come from from a middle class background, but I did, through parental support, have access to travel to Italy. The point I'm making is that the nature of the assessments that I'm looking at reflect very much of, tend to reflect a middle class experience of language learning and language exposure. And I think it's something we have to ask ourselves, is this something which is turning off people who, on the one hand, we're saying learn a language because it will give you access to employment, but on the other, are we teaching it and examining it in a way that says, but we're not really talking about your experience? And again, the danger of being sort of patronizing in that, but it does talk to a very middle class experience. And I think that's something that I want to think about. I'm still, as I say, at an early stage, and there are these more theoretical, more ideological aspects to be taken into consideration. I don't know if I've answered the question. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it's something I want to think about more too, the idea of how we present Italy to our students by the way we test some things. I think it's super compelling. And as I say, I'm rethinking what I'm going to do this whole summer now. There are a couple questions for Alberica that I'm going to put together into one question, even though they're very different. One questioner asks if you would like to comment on the long list of the Strega Prize from this year, because this year there were more women than there were men authors. And if you see this as a turning point, maybe, or rather, is it a turning point or an exception to the rule? And the other half of the question is that if you've had a chance to look at how the curriculum looks by men teachers as opposed to women teachers, women's writing sometimes gets seen as the domain of female teachers. And so if you wanted to respond to those issues.
Thanks very much. Let's leave and see about the Strega, because it has gone through many movements back and forth. So this is certainly a new thing, something different. And we will see what happens with the shortlist and then the prize, because the past 20 years have seen 2 women writers winning the prize, and there were no women winning the prize for, I believe, 12 years, with Elena Janecek winning it the year before last year. So we will see. They are making an effort, a conscious effort. So this is perhaps something that creates some discontinuity. So there has been debate about the selection, about the values involved, about the preferences. So it's something that is in movement. It's too early to say whether it is going to stay and actually become change, or it is a one-off recognition just to to keep going as before. We'll see. About men and women teachers, there are tendencies sometimes when a woman writer, like mainly Morante, really makes it into the highbrow literature, I'm talking about Italy now, then it is also taught by men professors. Most of the times where I found women writers taught in, I'm talking about university courses now, and then I did record the gender of the teacher when this was available. In very binary terms, I know, but this is kind of work that right now I'm doing in these terms. And then it tends to be women authors teaching women writers because they have a more interest, they're more proactive, but also for example, in my experience in the UK, also because there's a tendency by male professors to say, I'm not an expert. So maybe it's better that a woman teaches that. So yeah, this is the dynamic that I have recorded. Yeah.
Interesting. No, that's very interesting. Thank you very much. This, again, is another question for all four presenters. What do you see as the limits of disciplinarity, and how do you have any ideas about how to transgress those limits?
I mean, I feel like I'm transgressing those limits all the time with my research, right? I have a hard time saying, okay, I'm in this or this or this because I have so many interests, and I do see those connections. And I like to impart that on my students as well. And I teach a lot of outreach courses in English, but bringing in these multilingual texts. And so I have students from all across the university, a lot of students from the sciences, which is great. They bring a whole different perspective. And I ask them to bring in their perspectives into the classroom as we're analyzing these texts, because they provide a richness. They just provide something different, right? So yes, I'm all about, taking down those borders between disciplines. I think they're arbitrary, and it's, it's great to come from a disciplinary perspective, but to know that you shouldn't be confined by that discipline, right? And you should be in conversation with others.
Thank you. Other comments from other panelists?
Marie, I was going to say.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think, we in Italian studies we face a real challenge, because yes, we do all engage in interdisciplinary teaching. We engage with geography, history, sociology, linguistics, and so on. We're beyond the discipline. But at the same time, I think there's also, and I'm sure a lot of people will recognize this, the need to defend the discipline of Italian, because the danger is that if you are part of, if you don't have a strong identity as Italian studies, then there is always the danger that Italian studies will disappear. So I think we have that constant challenge that isn't necessarily felt as strongly even within other language disciplines. So I think we do have a particular challenges, and I think there's a lot of interesting work being done. If I look, for example, at work being done by colleagues in St Andrews in Scotland on the interdisciplinarity, the transdisciplinarity of Italian studies and beyond. There's fascinating work being done there. We have to, I think we do face challenges, as I said, in Italian studies, and the danger, there's possibly a danger that Italian studies as such can be disadvantaged within an institution unless there is a strong identity. So yeah,
right.
No answer, but just a question there, and a problem, an issue that we face, I think.
I know I felt it in the institutions I've taught at, that Italian can easily be marginalized, and then it's one step from marginal to erased. That's exactly what happens. Other comments on this question should I go on to the next question? Great. This one's really compelling to me personally because I've had similar experiences. This person asks, thank you very much for explaining the positive feedback from the students in your works to decolonize and diversify the curriculum, but has anybody else experienced pushback from students? And this person quotes a negative response from students who says they don't care about marginalized subjects and experiences. And those are, I would love to hear the panelists' reactions to that. Have you had pushback from students or colleagues or administrators?
Yes, colleagues. This partly answers the previous question. Frankly, I think one of the biggest challenges are the less progressive colleagues in my department, at least. Students, I do not recall any particular. I'm always very surprised by students that I perceive, perhaps wrongly, to be straight male students who choose to work on queer subjects. It's been amazing, and it's actually healed some of my own trauma with respect to young straight males. I'm still trying to unlearn being afraid of them. So I'm always very surprised by the positive reactions of particularly some students.
That's encouraging. Thank you. Alberica and Maya both have your hands, so shall we go in that order? Thank you. Okay.
Same experience as Paolo, never had pushback from students, really, actually quite the opposite. Sometimes I have liaised with students raising the problem of curricula with faculty. I did have not exactly pushback from colleagues, but more like playing down what I was doing, or like, why do you even do this, or this is not important. Yeah, but let's talk about the serious stuff here, the serious authors. That kind of maybe informal dismissal rather than actual pushback. But yeah, no, students have always been strong allies, actually, and they're quite vocal often in asking, can we do something different, please? So this is my experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maya, and then Mark.
Yeah, very similar students being vocal, calling for these things, wanting these things. And as Paolo said, I've caught myself judging students based on, how they appear and thinking, oh, they're going to give me pushback or they're going to do this. And sometimes they are, the most fervent sort of just admirers of this type of pedagogy, and so that gives me life, basically. Occasionally there'll be colleagues who push back, but there are more colleagues who are wanting to go in this direction, that the complaints from the less sort of liberal-minded colleagues just, they don't affect how we approach the curriculum usually.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I don't think the idea of proper Italian studies has disappeared completely. I think occasionally it resurfaces. In terms of pushback from students, I haven't personally experienced anything, but I know a colleague who is actually in this room. I don't know if Sylvia Ross wants to say anything, or is it far enough away that you can share this experience, or is it too...
I can speak briefly. I'm not one of the panelists, but I had a very, very difficult experience with a very intelligent, mature student male who was highly resentful of feminist approaches. I had included ijaba shego on the curriculum in a module on food and identity, and he was incredibly dismissive, and he gave a PowerPoint presentation that was unbelievable in terms of how offensive it was, not only to me, but also to the other students. So it was a critique basically of the whole syllabus in the course. So that kind of experience made it very difficult for me to negotiate giving everybody a voice. I found that very hard because I felt I should allow him a voice too, but really his voice was very often offensive. And students, actually what was very affirming, I think, was that students finally got fed up with him and said, "You're being incredibly offensive to all of us and to the teacher." So, but that was extremely painful, and I had to source documents on how to conduct a class discussion that was respectful. So I learned from it, but it was really, really painful. And there are probably a couple other people in this virtual space who know about the experience as well, and were quite upset. So the question of allowing everyone to have a voice is quite tough when you have someone who, now we have the terms for it, because he was quite vocal the day after Trump won the election, for example. That was, and in Ireland, which seemed very strange for me, but the sort of alt-right, I would say, ultimately is what I had in the classroom, and I found that very hard to negotiate.
Wow, that's super troubling. People are asking in the chat if you'd be willing to share the materials that you consulted. If you want to send them to me, I can make sure everybody gets them. If that's something, Sylvia, you'd be willing to do, is that okay?
Materials for discussion guidelines, is that it, or my syllabus?
Mm-hmm.
Discussion guidelines. Yep, certainly. In the chat now, or I don't know if I'll find it straight away, but I can certainly forward it to you as organizers.
Yes,
if that's of help. Yeah.
Yes, that would be really helpful. Thank you very, very much. Oh, yeah, thank you. Okay, your comments give me hope and also make me see the depth of the challenges that we face. There's another question for Paolo, if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on queer perspectives in Italian Canadians, and again, its application in the classroom, connections between Indigenous, queer, and Italian Canadian perspectives that could be explored, or if students see those subjects as taboo, if there's something that makes them, how they respond to that.
Okay, yeah, big question. So applications, well, reading queer texts, queer Italian Canadian texts, and say an Italian Canadian studies class I taught a course this year called Italian Canadian Culture and Identity. The first event of the queer project was part of the syllabus. So the students actually attended the event and wrote reflections on it. So even exposing students to these conversations where they can actually feel like they're seeing it happen, they're sort of seeing history, quote unquote, take a turn, right? Or things happening in their own community, and hearing the voices. And I think a big part of my work as a white scholar is to be accountable to certain communities, right? And so to actually just create the space for communities to speak for themselves and create platforms where students can actually communicate with those communities directly, as opposed to speaking on behalf of certain communities. While I am part of the queer community, I can't speak for trans folks or queer women, and those I think are voices that really need to be centered. I forget the second half of the question, but perhaps we can save time. I feel like I've spoken a lot.
It was about students' reactions to queer inclusions of these things, and I think, if you feel like
I'm always pleasantly surprised. I'm always quite anxious, particularly when I ask them to reflect on, when we watch some films, when there's some nudity, and particularly to do with transness. I'm always scared of the what I would perceive to be the straight males in the classroom. But so far so good. So far so good.
That's encouraging. That's very encouraging. There's another question for Maya about the concept that's such an issue in language acquisition about accuracy, and how that's seen as threatened by code switching. So, and especially the more languages you're code switching in, the question becomes more complicated. So the question is, I'm trying to summarize, in assessment in relation to these code switching things, are there certain local populations living in Italy and France that deal with these, or, how do you navigate that kind of code switching versus accuracy issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think it just depends on how you frame it, right? I think a lot of people see code switching as an inability to speak in one language and one language only, as opposed to sort of the the agentive reasons why people code switch, right? What it allows them to do, how it allows them to be creative with language, how it allows them to express meaning in different ways, right? So I spend a lot of time talking with students about motivations for code switching, why people code switch, and bring in my own data from that to show them that it's not because someone is a defective communicator, right? It's because they have all these different tools at their disposal and they're making use of these tools. And I have students reflect on times when they code switch in their lives. And even the students who only come from, say, an English-speaking background, you can think about how do you switch registers, for example? How do you speak to your friends differently than your professors? Have you noticed yourself making these switches while you're communicating, to show them that people code switch all the time, not just between languages, but between dialects, between registers and other ways, to think about what it means to speak the language.
Thank you. Okay, I feel kind of like maybe I've done an overly efficient job summarizing the questions, because I'm starting to come to the end. I'm going to just conclude with our final question, and I'm trying to summarize it. This person writes in and says, it's more of a comment than a question, and that is, there are many, many students who surprise us. And this person wants to share an experience of having students surprise us. I teach a course, and there are modules in Black Italian Americans, especially women, queer Italian Americans, again, women, and many male students tend to respond very affirmingly. And some even wrote poetry modeled on Rose Romano's poems or Kim Ragusa's memoir. And so this is all very encouraging. So the final comment, I think, is a very affirming one. This is the thing I say at the end of all my classes. Is there anything anybody just has to say before we conclude? Because well, this is your chance. Well, no, we also have tomorrow. Thank you then. Thank you. We are at the end of our time, but thank you again to our panelists, and thank you again to all of you for attending. I'm going to see if I can get this to work. I recorded digital applause, a loud applause. This is my applause to all of you. Thank you for attending, and thank you for your participation. And tomorrow we will meet at the same time. Simone Brioni will be moderating the discussion on filming and performing otherness, and we're looking forward to those 5 presentations. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending.